If you're thinking of upgrading from a sub 250 gram drone like the DJI Mini 4 Pro to something like the Air 3 or the Maverick 3 Pros, or you want to fly drones commercially, then you'll want to do the A2 CofC. And in this video, I'm going to cover why you would want it and everything that's in the syllabus so you know exactly what to expect when you go and do your training. One of the advantages of having the A2 CofC is you can fly drones like the DJI Air 3 at closer distances. It brings it from 150 meters down to 50 meters. So you could join a model aircraft club like the FPV UK and use Article 16 to fly your drone in parks and at closer proximity, but you wouldn't be able to use that commercially. So if you do want to fly drones commercially and do your GVC, which we'll cover in a later video, then you will need to have done your A2 CofC first, and you will have already learnt most of the material for the GVC. So you can do your A2 CofC in a classroom setting, which of course costs you a lot more than doing online e-learning. And there's many companies out there that do it, and it costs you around £100. And normally they do all the training free, and then you just pay for taking the exam at the end, which is quite a nice way of doing it. And there's many companies. I did mine with Copters, one of the larger training companies in the UK, but you could do it with HeliGuy or UAV Hub, are all very reputable companies. You will of course need to have done your DAMAs, which I've covered in previous videos, which you should see a link above, and that's doing your operator ID and your flyer ID. It's all online self-study. You have to do practical flight self-learning as well, and that's really just take your drone out and doing some maneuvers like doing a circle, a figure of 8, and what they call the top hat. You go long, up, down and along, and you just self-proclaim that you've done that training. You'll also need to do 4 hours of flying, and 2 hours can be before the training and 2 hours during, and that needs to be within the last 3 months. So my training was split up into 4 modules. So there was air law, safety, and the different categories that you fly in. And then module 2 covered all weather and meteorology. Module 3 was flight performance, and module 4 was operating principles, collision avoidance, and health and safety and medical fitness. And then there's the final examination, and that will be in your own office, on your computer, where you need to make sure it's not interrupted, otherwise it will be null and void. You've got no learning material on the walls, no other computer switched on, and you need to let them log in and see your screen, and that's with an exam invigilator. And the exam's 90 minutes and consists of 30 multiple choice questions. Now, one of the reasons I want to take you through the syllabus is because I want to highlight the things you need to know and the things you'll definitely certainly want to know for the actual examination. I did find, because I didn't know that, I kind of overlearnt and overstudied. So it meant when I did come to do the exam, I was actually well prepared and probably over prepared, and I was a bit nervous. So the 90-minute examination, I just rushed through it because I was that nervous that I actually did it in 16 minutes. But fortunately I did get 97%. So it's worth learning all the material thoroughly, and especially if you want to do your GVC, because it'll put you so far ahead when you come to do that. Now, this isn't a training session, but I'm going to cover all the material, but I'm going to highlight the bits that are really important that I think you do need to remember for your exam, because they're things that are very likely to come up. And there's other elements here that you kind of need to know, but they're not going to be really relevant to the exam. So let's get into it. I'm going to give you a bunch of very useful web links, and I'll put those in the description below. Also in the description below, I'm going to put the useful abbreviations that will continually crop up in the drone world, but specifically in all your training as well. Now, these you'll get used to the more you are studying and reading and using the general language. In module 1, we'll start to be looking at specific requirements. Now, some of the information covered is all about the C0, C1, C2, C3, C4 drones and their categories. I'm not going to bother covering that now because although that's something they suggest you learn, the fact is we probably will never adopt the C rating. The CAA are looking at having their own rating. So we talk about legacy aircraft and non-legacy, and the fact is at the moment it's not really relevant to us, and therefore it can become quite confusing because we do now have drones that do have the C ratings on them, so it can be confusing thinking that's what we need to know, but it's not UK law, it's not part of our regulations. So in the UK we call it legacy aircraft, which is your sub 250 gram, sub 500, sub 2 kilogram and sub 25 kilogram drones. So we look at the legacy aircraft, and it's the sub 250 gram drone, and that can fly in the A1 to A3 categories. The sub 500 gram drones fly in the A1 if you've got the A2 CofC, Certificate of Competency, or a sub 2 kilogram drone can fly in the A2 category with the A2 CofC. Now, if you have the sub 250 gram drone, as you'll know, in the A1 category, you can fly over people. If less than 25 kilograms, you're within the subcategory of A3, limits flying far from people. So the open category, we've got 3 subcategories, the A1, the A2 and A3. In the A1 category, the rules are read the manual and do your DAMAIRS online training, which you will have done. And in the A2 subcategory, it's to do the A2 CFC. We'll ignore the 30 meter horizontal because that's if it's a C2 rated drone, which is not relevant to us. So we're at 50 meters from uninvolved persons, no flying over people. And in the A3 subcategory, again, it's do your DAMAIRS and it's flying far from people. Then in the specific category, you need your GVC. It's where we're flying at an increased risk. And you need to understand Article 241, which is endangering the safety of any person or property. You must not fly recklessly or negligently or cause or permit an aircraft to endanger any person or property, and you'll need to do the required training. And then lastly, there's a certified category, which is flying at high risk. So this is equivalent to manned aircraft operations or carrying passengers with a drone. So all this information is in the CAP 722, which is the civil aviation publication, and that's where all our drone regulations have been laid out. And in this next section, we're looking at avoidance of collision, and the incident and accident is recorded in the CAP 382, and that's where the mandatory occurrence reporting scheme is laid out. Again, there's links to all this down below. Mandatory occurrence reporting, known as MORS, is now requires the operator to report all serious incidences and accidents on CARES, the European Coordinated Centre of Accident and Incident Reporting System. Accidents involving people must be reported to the AAIB, and with any airspace incursions, you need to get a witness statement and take any photos. Then there's a UK Airprox board, which you would use the form CA 1094. And these are all worth remembering. And there's a useful chart here of what to do when you had an incident. Where does that fall and who do you report to? So next, if we look at controlled airspace, we've got class A, C, D, E, G. And as you can see from this chart here, we can see where our drones can fly, which generally, if I can simplify this, is in class D or G airspace at maximum of 400 feet. Now class D is controlled airspace, but you don't necessarily always need any authorization within that unless you're in an FRZ. It just means that air traffic control do have control of that airspace. Now you can fly in other airspaces, but that's where the GVC would come into it, so you can make specific applications to do that. It's worth noting that Class A airspace is up to surface to 19,500 foot. Class C is the upper space above 19,500 feet to 60,000, so way out of our scope. D are the lower levels around airports that are below 10,000 feet. E is local terminal maneuvering areas, and so all other airspace is uncontrolled, and that's called Class G. The thing to remember that is also used by helicopters, and they're not limited to 400 feet and could be flying below that. Most other manned aircraft would be flying above 500 feet, so there's a 100-foot separation distance there. So if we look at flight restricted zones, an FRZ, and aerodrome traffic zone, an ATZ, an ATZ is 2.5 nautical miles, circle from the center of the runway and from ground up to 2,000 feet with a radius of 2.5 nautical miles around the midpoint of the largest runway. For aerodromes where the longest runway is longer than 1,850 meters. Now, the runway protection zone has been added more recently over the last couple of years, and that is 5 kilometers from the end of a runway, and it's 1 kilometer wide. And you can see this from this diagram. An air traffic zone plus a runway protection zone equals the flight restricted zone, so that whole grayed out area. So now if we move on to the second module, we're talking about weather, and things to take into account is with higher altitude you're going to get lower pressure, the molecules are going to be less dense, the air is going to be less dense, and so that's going to affect the drone's performance. It's not going to perform as well in the less dense air. If you think about the propellers, props having to push against a material to create lift, well then if it's less dense, then there's going to be less control. And so when it's colder, it's going to be denser, and when it's hot, it'll be less dense because the molecules are expanded and moved away from each other. So again, in hot air, there'll be reduced performance. So that means the best conditions for generating lift is on a dry, cold, winter's morning near sea level. If you were to look at the extreme example, the worst conditions are in the middle of the summer, high up in the mountains, in a tropical rainforest at midday, for example. So things to take into account then will be the wind speed and direction, visibility, weather, the clouds, the temperature, pressure, turbulence. Now with turbulence, there's the mechanical, thermal and shear to take into account. And these questions do come up in your exam, so you want to really make sure you understand those. And then there's the wind, the gradients, urban effects and masking. So that's all useful information when you're preparing a flight plan to do your pre-flight checks. Now when you're on site, you'll need to be looking at the weather conditions where you're flying on that particular day, and you'll need to know the speed and parameters of your aircraft as well. You need to be aware of gusts, any cloud cover, and any wind compression and how that will affect your drone. Another thing to take into account is getting icing on the props in cold, damp weather, because you're going to get that low pressure forming on the top of a wing, and so that can create moisture to condense and can even get icing on there, which would affect your stability. You also need to take into account overheating of the drone, the visibility, fog and mist, and it's considered fog or mist if your visibility is less than 1 kilometer. Is the sun giving in the eyes, clouds are too low, and are there any stratus, cumulus or precipitation? So stratus is the flat clouds, cumulus is when they're heaped up. So then if we look at clouds, so as you can see from this drawing, stratus clouds are flat, cumulus are heaped, and then precipitation is rain. A cumulus nimbus is a cloud formation that occurs at 3 distinct levels. So in the stratus, it's up to 6,000 feet. Alto is 6,000 to 20,000 feet, and cirrus is over 20,000 feet. So when you look up into the sky, you can get an idea of what height those clouds are at and are they likely to affect us. So then next we'll just look at IP ratings. So IP43, this is international protection, this stands for, and this is the first digit is its protection from solids, and the rating of 4 will be protection from a solid of an object that's 1 millimeter. The second digit refers to protection from water. A rating of 3 shows protection from sprays of water up to 60 degrees. And again, this is a question that does crop up, so it's worth trying to just remember that as well. So in module 3, we're looking at the operating guidelines. So we're looking how our drones actually work. So in flight, it's created by thrust, weight, drag, and lift. So if you look at the diagram here, thrust is obviously the forward motion, it's counterbalanced by the weight going down, the lift that's drawing it up, and then drag by it's just sheer mass moving through the air. You also want to understand ring vortex state, and that's as the drone is descending, it's the air coming up around it that can give turbulence, that can make it fly out of control. To counteract that, if you fly your drone into landing at an angle, then it will stop that happening. Although with modern drones, they've got built-in systems and sensors to make sure this doesn't happen, but it's still a thing you need to understand. And then we just look at the procedures for setting up your drone. Have you checked the calibration on the IMU? Have you checked the calibration of the compass? Do you know how to shut off the motors in an emergency? In-flight procedures under normal operating conditions or under abnormal operating conditions. You need to really understand this, so that's why it's important to know your drone and read your manuals properly. And then post-flight, this is all about recording all the information from where you flew, the takeoff time, the landing time, any abnormal occurrences, etc. And your performance operation envelope, as we call it, is also something you need to know. So things like what's your battery life, what's the usable temperature for your batteries, what's the correct aircraft temperature so you know you're not going over that, what's the maximum speed, what's gusts, is the maximum gust it could fly in, and through this you can do your setup checklist. Next is understanding emergency procedures, so loss of power, loss of the GPS signal, what happens if you have a flyaway, a fire, structural failure, pilot incapacitation, an air incursion or a ground incursion, and what your fail-safes are, e.g. your return to home, your loss of a GPS signal or your connection to the RC, or if you suddenly get a low battery, and what's your kill switch, like what's the emergency if you need to stop your drone flying immediately. So looking at maintenance and logbooks, it's the remote pilot's responsibility to keep these up to date, not the operators, because it's you that will have flown the mission, and it's that person that needs to know that aircraft is in good condition at the moment of flying and to record that. So we use a system of flight reference cards for pre-flight. The flight reference cards for pre-flight should include all those relevant checks on both aircraft and the maintenance that needed to be performed. And so you can do routine maintenance logs for the aircraft, and they should be checked and dated regularly. And of course you're recording where and when you've flown as well. So if other people are using the drone, they'll know what conditions it's been flown in and if there's anything that they need to check. And of course, doing your regular software and firmware updates. Then there's always your test flight, so do a physical check, any prop wear, battery swelling, are there any gimbal issues, checking your GPS signal so you know your return to home will work okay, check the maneuverability, Are the lights all working? Telemetry, height reading and compass is all correct. And then we're just looking at mass and balance. Your maximum takeoff weight is really important. Now payloads, how will increased weight affect your performance? How will increased drag affect your performance? So top heavy payload will lean the aircraft into wind and helps responsiveness. Bottom heavy will tilt it back and make it less stable and less responsive. And again, that's a question that is very likely to come up as well. Other things that need checking is your CU, it's like your motherboard, the gyro, the GPS, barometric pressure gauge height, accelerator, collision avoidance, the sonar and optical flow, compass, satellites, and batteries. The next, if you're looking at batteries, they should be stored with no more than 50% in them. These days, most modern drones have intelligent batteries and they will reduce their charge in their cases down to 50%. So pre-flight, you need to make sure you've charged your batteries up to 100%. And it's worth noting, batteries are good for 200 to 400 cycles to avoid any swelling. So that's why it's good to record the usage of all your batteries. And don't leave them charging overnight because that's when they're most vulnerable. Then if we look at traveling with your kit with batteries, they must be in your hand luggage. Now, if it's less than 100 watt hours, you can carry as many of those as you like. If they're 100 to 160, you can carry 2 of them. If they're over 160, they're not allowed. So just to put that into context, an Air 3 battery is 62 watt hours. So you could carry as many of those as you like. And a Mini 3, Mini 4 Pro, they're 18 watt hours. So again, you can carry as many of those as you like. So now moving on to module 4, very likely be asked this, but the insurance you need to have is the EC 785/2004. It's worth remembering that because I've had that question come up, and they'll ask you, is it this one or is it that one in multiple choice? So it's worth remembering that. So now looking at some of the operating principles, which primarily is we're flying VLOS, visual line of sight. Other factors you need to take into account are stress. Typical things are, you know, if there's a tech problem, do you have a plan B? With yourself, things that can cause you stress is not sticking to your plan. You haven't got the skill levels, you haven't got the capability. So just make sure you're flying your mission within your abilities. Traveling to a job can be stressful. Any personal problems can be stressful. And then the client, the pressure of getting the job done in a time frame or them asking you to do things that weren't agreed can also cause stress. One of the ways around that is actually getting the client involved. So ask them to be a spotter or for any aircraft in the air or for people interrupting the operation. Then we're looking at occurrence reporting and investigations. So this may be where there's an injury or something's been damaged or something's missing from the aircraft. And then we're looking at congested areas of operation. So in the flight planning, plan each flight from start to finish, identify any hazards or any risks, or do you need to do a risk assessment? And if possible, if you believe you can mitigate the risks some way, then set that out and adopt a see and avoid approach. And you'll hear this come up quite a few times, the see and avoid. Scan the airspace regularly, utilize an observer, as we just mentioned, or you can use the client or have someone with you that's your lookout, your observer. Always anticipate the unexpected and plan for the worst scenarios. And we always adopt a go, no go approach. So you have to, before launch, take everything into consideration and make that decision. Is this safe to fly now, and can I complete the mission, and make a go, no go decision. So this will be based on your UAS airworthiness, Has the crew been briefed properly? Are you fit and capable to execute the operation? Is your crew fit and capable? Is the risk as low as possible? Is it safe? Is the airspace clear? And is anyone that's not involved out of the launch and landing zone? And then we look at medical fitness. And as I mentioned earlier, we use the I'm Safe acronym, and that is illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, eating. So, do you feel unwell? Are you on any medication? Is anything really stressing you out that may affect your ability to fly? Have you had any alcohol? So the best thing to go by is have none, but you would consider it similar to driving a car. Fatigue, are you tired or exhausted? And have you eaten and drunk enough? On that little final part of health and safety, that pretty much concludes everything you need to know within the online training. So I hope that's demystified the A2 CofC training and examination, so you know exactly what to expect. Now, if you want to see more videos about training and courses, there's a playlist over here. Keep an eye out for the video on Article 16 and the future one on the GVC. So subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and I'll look forward to seeing you hopefully over there.